Right, we're on. So this week's call, the first portion of this, we're going to be talking about a video that we've all watched about percentage-based training, specifically for working sets versus RPE-based training, or like drop-offs, i.e. if you do a top set of 200 kilos and then you take a reduction of 10% off that, for example. And then we're going to discuss the biases that this individual has spoken about it, and then can we correlate our biases? Can we talk about our biases? How does that formulate our own coaching philosophy per se? Because I think a lot of time when we talk about biases, we always say that biases can be a bad thing, but we don't talk about how biases can be a good thing, and we don't lean into it enough. So I kind of want to go down that avenue of what are we biasing right now that's a good thing for our programming modalities. So just to go off of the video first and foremost, Matt talks about percentages and how he biases more percentage-based back-off work compared to RPEs and other modalities. First and foremost, does anyone use this type of modality within their own training, and potentially why? Go on, Kun. I saw your face first. We spoke about this.
So I do, not frequently, but I use it where it's a percent drop off of a top set, whether it's single, triple, or fours. And it's mostly for individuals that they don't have great weight selection yet. So I give them a reduction of that top set. But the issue that I've ran into with that one is a lot of the times they overshoot, and then therefore the drop set is going to be an overshoot as well. So to kind of fix that, I've gone into, like, after the first or second week, I tend to kind of know where their low should be at. I give them a cap and then do the percent drop off that way. But that's like the main way I do it.
I do like to use percentage-based work, especially with newer athletes, but it depends. If you're using percentage-based work, you're kind of taking away the athlete's ability to develop their understanding of RPE. So it's very circumstantial. I quite like to use block 1, 2, and 3 to gauge an athlete's ability or understanding of RPE. And then based off of, or if, for example, in block 1, they're aggressively overshooting, then I would implement percentage-based work and say, this is what the RPE territory should be. But it depends on how aggressive. Can I rein that in before implementing percentage-based work? I also use it as a strategy to pin certain days to allow other days to perform. So again, if it's a newer athlete, I kind of want them to understand what a priority day is, so maybe their primary squat, and I use it on their secondary day, say this is a day where I want the workload to be slightly reduced. So again, if we're coming back to the idea that they're overshooting aggressively, I'll first implement a percentage drop on their secondary day, just to create a little bit more space for that primary day to perform, but also still manage their ability or exposure to develop their understanding of RPE. So there's a couple aspects, I'm sure we'll come to this within the call, but that's how I quite like to use percentage-based work.
I think one of the big things for me, it was the beginning of his recording, talking about basically why it steered away from RPE and saying that it was because it left too much to interpretation. And I think most of the modalities were discussed in the idea of being like, which one's best for damage control, which was kind of bugging me. Of like the idea of being like, well, if you use RPE, then the athlete could screw it up, as opposed to RPE does not work, because it does. And like, it's not really, I don't think it's something we're actually debating. And then when we're talking about, like, do we do fixed percentage as a reduction, as Kun's just spoken to, that what we're saying is if they screw up the top set, like big overshoot or big undershoot, then that reduction becomes somewhat null to what the intent was. And so I think, like, the reason I often bias RP is because I cannot stop watching Brandon's dogs. They're having the best time. the bias towards RPE is often like, my assumption is that I am teaching my athletes a lot, and then I know that I can systemize like the individual session pretty well. I think the big thing of RPE that he spoke to and where I do use it is where mistakes become too common. And so if it's like someone's running working sets too aggressively, as Kim says, then like I'll put in that percentage reduction, try to distance a little bit so that at least they get a gauge of it over the first couple of weeks, and that softens the later decisions. But I feel like a lot of percentage is typically being used to damage control or a lack of trust of the athlete.
I actually have a question off the back of this because I'm in a bit of a unique circumstance with an athlete who like chronically undershoots even top sets. And it seems to very much be like more so a mental thing. And without me like putting a load on it of being like, yeah, you should be exactly here, whether I should be doing like percentage ranges, whether I should be doing load ranges based off of those percentages, or as you're saying, like same principle of like percentage back downs, but just using a smaller percentage so that like, well, if you're going to undershoot the top set, then this is roughly what it's going to be. Or if like in our coding within the programs, if we're going, okay, well, if the RPE rating is whatever, less than the intended top, then we do X percentage down regular, all of that, right? That could get into a very complex like equation. But what do we think of that? Instead of like thinking about using it for damage control, using it towards the other end of like, you actually have to be hitting adequate stimulus. And so we're using a smaller percentage drop or whatever to be able to achieve that.
I'll let someone else answer in full. I've just had an idea that would be really cool. You know, like when we do, like say you've got ascending whatever, so like ascending triples. So you do your triple at 5, and then it's like, okay, now it's a 5% increase. So like pinning the increase as opposed to reductions, because that I don't play with, and that kind of forces legitimacy. Just an idea. Anyway, someone else can answer.
Well, I think you mentioned a really good point there. So you could program, let's say you're aiming for RPE 6. You can program an RPE 6 for them, but then add a percentage on top of that, knowing that they're going to undershoot. And then when they hit that following set, they might actually hit that target RPE. And it's like, this is actually what the RPE should have been for that previous set. And you can change their perspective of RPE through that method Callum suggested. I think it can be a lot simpler by forcing the athlete to send a video to you or the athlete chat for an RPE check. And then people will provide their opinions, see that they've undershot, and say, okay, why don't you take another single on top of that 5 kilo heavier, depending on obviously what their top weight is. So I think that's a much more simplistic approach to that. Force them to make use of the service and then go from there.
Brian, so that we answered part of Brandon's questions, which ones do you have a preference for? Like someone's an undershooter, so do you go, and again, we're talking bias, right? So you got to go top tier down. Would you prioritize like the load, like a load range, like setting a load minimum or a percentage minimum? Or like where you're saying trying to keep them closer to the bracket? What would have been your preference?
I would personally give them a percentage. Like if they've been chronically undershooting, we can kind of make an assumption of what percentage of 1RM it is, and trying to figure out why they're scared of going up even more. Why are they undershooting? For the most part, half the time, from my experience, they don't have the confidence to go up. They don't want to make that choice because they're afraid of overshooting. That's what I tend to find. That's what I see. So I simply give them more. Like I will set a certain percentage and I'll go, on this given day, whatever day it is, I want you to record each and every single set, send it to me. And then obviously we have that conversation, but I want you to hit this percentage. And then I want us to then have a discussion about it. How did it feel? How did it make you feel when you're getting under that bar? Is there anything that we can change going into the following week? If I've got a 4-week block, I might do 3 weeks of set percentages and go, no, this is how it should feel. I've got an RPE range within my head as to what it should be around, because you should have a good perspective of the percentage of the 1RM and an RPE rating for what that could be. And then I'll set them an RPE rating on that 4th week and go, let's see if your confidence has risen, let's see if what we've done in these past few weeks have actually worked, and then let it be in their own hands.
I think one element of that is because I completely agree. Effectively, we're talking about post-event learning, right? Like, so they do the thing, then we feedback, but the feedback loop on that's relatively long. Like the time between, like, all I mean is primary squat day to primary squat day is a week, and so like what in the moment processes would have like at least some efficacy to create change. And I was just thinking to like, you're someone who undershoots, of being like how I would lace that the protocol to force at least understanding for a shorter feedback loop. So like what I have done rarely, but still do. Let's say that I want to hit the double is supposed to be challenging. So the double target is at 6. I will give them the like, let's say double at 7. So I'll give them a single at 6 and then repeat load for the 7. And so like when they hit it and it's so much sub of being like, okay, we know the single wasn't legitimate. Like trying to force learning in the programming itself. How's Loki getting on? Yeah, so like I think the division of the ascension into the working sets is kind of where you can get the most opportunity. So like whether it's triple into even a set of 4. So the triple first has to be a 6, and then the set of 4 is plus 5 kilos. So you're like forcing that set to be more accurate at least, so that you can program them effectively, leading to an overshoot. And even if it's someone who's chronically undershooting by 2 RPE, I just program 2 RPE. Like I'll program the other direction more aggressively. I know we tangented, but I thought it was a really cool question.
Has that helped with your mindset at all, Brandon? Like, what's your thoughts on all that? Like, where's your mind gone to with that?
I like lean pretty heavily to like kind of the same principle that we all do, but obviously tailoring and catering to the individual in front of you. And so if I'm aware that someone's like, because again, RPE is subjective and it's supposed to be. And so if the hardest thing that you've ever done is the hardest thing that you've ever done, then that is your frame of 10. So for me, it's like, well, if the hardest thing that you've ever done is like a genuine, as what most coaches or what the remainder of the world would call like a 7 or an 8, then I will very typically just lean on like, okay, well, I'll just program an RPE or 2 RPE higher. Like it's very much just like, I will match my programming to your scale of RPE, and as I see that change, it will naturally change, right? Because we'll not have the room to do so anymore. So it very much becomes that. I have like used percentage as far as like percentage backup goes, or keeping like a relative intensity based off of what the top set is, and that can be very valuable in like providing an opportunity for learning. So if you're like, okay, well, this is the relative intensity of what this should be relative to the top set. So if the top set is a 7, we use a percentage down regulation, that gives us an RPE of whatever, right? And so if we can kind of, I'll usually put in the notes section, this should be about a 6 or about a 6.5, right? And that usually gives them a good idea of like, oh, okay, so this is what that feels like, rather than, I very much struggle to go full percentage based, because on the long term, like if I was to say, this isn't the point, but if I was to say if I could only use percentage or only use RPE, if I were using percentage on a long term, at some point I would have to be looking at like 102, 103, 104%, because people are naturally going to get better. And then you have to figure out as the coach, well, to what degree are we better in each lift? Like I might be able to do that with deadlift, but I may never be able to do that with bench. And so it just comes down to like, with that RPE, it gives you that opportunity to be able to have them make that decision relative to how it's actually feeling to them within that same framework of like, the hardest thing you've ever done is the hardest thing you've ever done.
The last bit you said I wanted to speak to as well is like, how many people here have had someone hit a new PB but for reps? Yeah, write that percentage. Like, this is one of the things that fundamentally annoys me about being totalitarian with percentage, of being like, well, I had someone hit their first PB and they tripled it, so I would have written 103% times 3. I would not want them to screenshot that and post that online because I look stupid, but also because I wouldn't know to program it. And so like the RP allowance, and that's why that like I'm using the word a lot, I'm not trying to flex the word, but totalitarian approach, where he was like, now it's almost all percentage. I understand the justifications, but you cannot favor one model. It's why we all lace our programming with both. And that, I think my bias is to not do one of them. It was actually one of my biggest takeaways, was like that I fundamentally disagree with having an approach. but yeah, just it was the example of like the PRs typically in rep ranges don't match percentages, and that really bugged me.
I wanted to ask a question of, for a chronic undershooter, why don't you guys just do like a specific load? Tell them just to hit like a certain range.
Yeah, so this is what I was getting at. That's what I would do. I would set it out as a percentage, or I would just give them a certain load. That is, if I understand that it's within the capabilities where form doesn't break down, and I'm very trustworthy of, no, you've got the capability of doing it, I will just set the load. They'll often have a little bit of a panic. They might have to do it a second time, but as soon as they do that second time, they go, oh shit. And then the next week is amazing. The week after, it's typically a trust issue of themselves.
See, when you're programming percentages, I've just had this thought pop into my head. See, when you're programming percentages, do you just write it down in intensity as a 1/3 at 92%? So in other words, in order for me to figure out what that load would be, I'd have to go onto a calculator, type in my max, and type in times 0.92, right? Or am I being wrong?
It depends whether or not, like, I'm not speaking to for anyone here, but most coaches either is that they are literally typing, they're doing the maths themselves. Like a lot of coaches will have a document that's just percentages type, and they'll have the maths written on top. So they'll type the load in, or some coaches just write the percentage of.
Okay, because this is probably like nuanced, but to me, if I was always typing in my like ascertained max and then typing times 0.92 or whatever the percentage is, that would psych me out. Like I'd literally, it would, I feel like that would just subconsciously ingrain like, yep, 210, that's it, that is your max. I'm like, oh, when do I get to change that? We don't know, but we're going to operate off of this until you do. Do you know what I mean? Of like, even if I'm doing a 98% triple or a 103% triple, I'm like, oh yeah, but my ascertained max is still 210. Do you know what I mean? I feel like that on a psychological level, because again, coaching is like this very full spectrum thing of like programming is fantastic, but you also have to look at the effect that the programming is going to have on the psychology of the individual. And I feel like that for a lot of people, particularly if it's actually forcing you to type in the thing every single time, then that has a psychological effect. Otherwise, if you're just writing the load in, then I don't really see a huge difference between that and just a load cap, because you can pull an arbitrary number out of nowhere, but you're operating on the understanding that this RPE is roughly this percentage, which is roughly this load. Like they're all so interlinked that if it just appears as a load on the program, then what's the point in not just using RPE? Am I making sense here?
The bit that you're saying at the end, so the reasoning would be that they're non-arbitrary numbers. So like we can rely on the fact that I know roughly. So like let's say it was talking about Brandon deadlift, I could pick a number that I know is roughly the sort of RPE, which means I know roughly the percentage, because we know the percentages that are linked to those RPEs. So we can kind of gauge that as a peripheral. Their argument would be that it's more exact, and so it's being very specific to it. My argument back would be that it's not specific, because everyone's response to any percentage range massively varies. I wanted to devil's advocate the first thing you said of the inverse, where one of you, Brandon, said, I forget, this is like a podcast effectively, is that in saying that like they have to look at their max and then they look at the percentage and they're like, oh, it's so whatever. The point being that it can work to the inverse, because it worked with Lucy with a couple of weeks ago at a deadlift, is sometimes it reminds them not to have to work as hard. So I'm like, okay, 90% for a double, and you're like, oh, it's only that much. Like I don't have to be pushing the load. And though I don't favor the system, I do think there is benefit to percentage of reminding. Like most of us know, like if you're doing rep work on your deadlift, 67% through 83%, massive range, but like has versatility of application. But if all of us sat down and went, well, what's 67% of my deadlift? You'd be like, I wouldn't put that on the bar. So I think there is some application of letting a lifter see that. That is a nice reminder. Lucy, go on, you're going to say.
Literally everything on what you've already said is basically similar to how I feel. I don't like top set percentages, because you never know where your 1RM actually is. Like your 1 rep max in a competition, your strength throughout on like any other day when you're not competing isn't the same. Like sometimes you're stronger, sometimes you're weaker. Like that's why I actually appreciate RPE, because it takes into account externals. Like I could hands down say tomorrow when I walk into the gym, if I'd had to do a 1x3 on a percent based on my 1RM from my last comp, like I wouldn't feel the same level of strength that I did on that comp day. So you either have got stronger or like you're slightly weaker due to externals, etc. So percentage wise for a top set is something I would generally try to avoid. Percentage drops for working sets is definitely something I 100% agree with. Go on.
Can I play devil's advocate and pull the string or pull the thread on this principle and just take it into the extreme? Because if we're using percentage for the sake of being more precise and not using arbitrary numbers, then why aren't we running the same microcycle like RTS do until it's no longer effective? Because if we're looking for analytical data, then you run the same thing all the time, 8s all the time, high specificity, high data collection, nothing varies, so you can very easily tell what's being actually controlled and changed.
People that no one wants to do that.
Right, but that's the extreme of the principle of like, if we're literally just looking at like, yes, it's highly precise, yes, it's highly analytical, then pull the thread on that and go the whole way to the other end of the spectrum. Like there's pros and cons of each one of these positions of like, yes, it's highly analytical, but as Lucy says, like if you're coming in and you know for a fact it's like, okay, well, this percentage is what the load I'm putting on the bar today. What if you don't get there because you had a really poor day? What if you have an astonishing day and you just get there, and like a lot of other coaching areas, or rather coaching fields, don't have really, really short feedback loops or pride themselves on communications. You hit that top set, you had a fantastic day, but it turns out to be a 6 instead of an 8. And it's your last heavies. Like what do? You just had a phenomenal day.
The only bit that I want to push on is the suggestion that the extreme of percentages like the RTS approach, because though it's data specific, they're still living by the system of saying like the certain intensities are like valid for training and that should vary. Like their belief is still, so only because for someone listening going, the use of percentage does not lean inherently to like the RTS permanent structure. The rest of it, I agree. Ryan, what are we talking about now?
I'm back. Okay. Oh, go on, Luce.
I'm just gonna fill that little gap. I also use percentages when I really don't want someone to overshoot. I think for me, percentages are more useful to keep people like not undershooting, but keep people working, like their working sets lower than where they should be. Like bench, for example, people are generally more likely to push their bench. Say it's like meant to be an RP6, that's generally more likely to be an overshoot. So it's something that I even get, like I get a minus 10% on my bench, which makes a huge difference, but compared to like my 1x1 compared to my 2x2. So using percentage drops on bench, I think especially help just to keep those working sets less aggressive. And for things like for accessories like split squats, using set load and percentages there really help people to not massively overshoot, I think, or undershoot as well. Because people think because you're only using one leg, like it's half the weight of your top, like your 1RM, but actually it shouldn't be that much. It should be above 50%, depending on your skill level on where you should split squat. So I think using percentages and setting load on split squats, especially as an accessory, is really useful. And it's one of those things that like couldn't necessarily use it for like a leg press, because every leg press is different. Whereas an accessory like split squats is generally the same for anyone that does it.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here. So if I'm talking about my biases when I'm programming, if I'm looking at set percentages, it would definitely be for working sets to control the athlete in a particular manner. So typically they would have some form of regulated top set 1x3 at RP 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever that might be. If they're doing 3 sets of 5 as working sets, I might give them 1 set of 5 at a set RPE. Give them the benefit of doubt, give them that exposure, give them the opportunity to express what they feel like they got on the day. And then for the other 2 sets, I might put a percentage load depending on the athlete that I've got in front of me. But I like to mix it up in both ways, in the sense of I'll give them some autonomy, because an athlete needs to learn how they feel on a given day. But at the same time, I do like to control some form of stimulus, especially if it's on a secondary day. If I want to control how much intensity they get on that given day to then lead into a primary day, or on a tertiary day to then lead into a primary day. But that is heavily tailored towards squats and deadlifts. I tend to fall more into set loads, very much like what you said, Brandon, about an athlete having to do all that for their bench. Like in terms of the whole working out, I like to give them just a set load for their bench. But that's how I tend to program, and that's my bias towards programming right now. And I quite like the style of it. So coming off of the back of that, obviously we said we're going to go off on a tangent if no one else has anything else to say. The next thing was a case of what biases do we all play into within our own programming, coaching. And I asked everyone to think of one thing that they can think of within their programming that they heavily biased towards. Now, we know programming is all individual, but there's set modalities that we do lean into. So who wants to start off with that?
I'll have to give some just until, if at any point whoever wants to go next to shoot your hand up, but like things that I heavily bias against, I don't program banded shit. Like I just won't do it. Almost ever. Like, and it's not even because I don't think there's any sort of efficacy to it, but at this stage, I have found every route around it that seems to be substantially faster, and I don't want to waste an athlete time. Like, there's very ad hoc incidences where I'm like, oh, okay, someone who really doesn't understand the hinge, like there are ways to set up a band that can really aggressively reinforce it. But like, this statement sounds way more arrogant than I intended, but I consider myself a better coach than needing that. Of being like, I can find a way to teach them substantially faster than having to get them to get banned and strap themselves into a squat rack. And same thing on bench, where I'm like, I just don't. Not only is there not enough studies in favor of it, and I'm sure there are coaches that are really successful with it, but I just see it as relatively poor feedback for the athlete, poor application from a coach. Don't do it. Who else has one? What's a bias anyone's like, I think is silly? Oh, Lucy, you got one, okay.
So one that I used to definitely have changed this since, but I used to basically write a block and be like pretty certain that it would have to remain the same, exactly the same, for 4 to 5 weeks. So for example, I'd give someone like 1x3 and then a 3x6, and that would run for 4 weeks. Hugely like got rid of that mindset, because although each block has kind of a goal that it's going to lean into, there is no reason that they need to remain the same. I've started using like an additional set of, say, like 1x3 and then another 1x3 at different RPE to help them essentially warm up correctly, and making sure that if we are uncertain that they're going to hit the RPEs, that it kind of gives them another shot to take it. If you give them like a 5.5 and then a 5, a 5 and then a 5.5, if they're currently undershooting, you can guarantee that more often than not, that they're going to hit at least one of those sets to the right RPE. So that's something I've started to like train into people, and then also remove later on down the weeks, so they've got that opportunity to meet the targets, to meet the RPEs, to meet the percentages that we wanted them to hit. But it doesn't have to stay consistent for all of the 4 to 5 weeks in a block.
Off of the back of that, would that also encapsulate extending a block as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something I've done only maybe once. I added in 1 extra week because they did undershoot. And after like the weekly check-in, I made sure that they had the like capacity to take another week. I didn't want them to be super fried, then push themselves even more, and then it take longer for the taper recover to come in. But because they were still relatively new, their like RP7 was still like a 6, so we had room to push into like what I wrote like an RP 8 week, but actually they still only hit 7.5. So they weren't like massively fragged, but more often than not, I'll end up taking a week off than I will add a week on.
And so I'm going to keep giving ones that are stupid until someone jumps in before me. But one of the ones that like I'm just advocating for things that my bias is against. One of them is like overcorrecting myself. So I spoke to Brandon about this, where we're talking about programming of like, you have the thought, you write the thing, and you're like, okay, that's good. And then if you sit with it in front of you, no different from anything in life, like you're like, oh, but what if? And then you completely ruin the thing you wrote. And so sometimes like I will write something and my bias is against changing it because I'm having second guesses. I'm like, run it for at least a week. Like just stick to the initial thought. Because like with there being 1,000 ways to skin a cat, you can have an idea and be like, okay, well, I think I can fix their squat if I introduce the high bar work and the primary stuff I'll keep to what it is. And then an hour later, you're like, but if I go high bar both days, and then you just end up with this like ridiculous idea of programming and you ruin what you had planned. So my bias is against too often second guessing myself, at least at the beginning. Obviously, I'm questioning my decisions in the first place, but not repeatedly.
I think we can all be guilty of that because we're trying to get this perfect recipe when there probably isn't one. And that first initial thought was probably the thing that's going to fix it. Because I tend to find is if we overthink it, we change more. But if we change more, we don't know what was wrong in the first place. We don't know what the root cause was. So I like the idea. I think we've all been there. I've certainly been there and I'll be there again. But it is right. Like you have to have the confidence to trust in your first initial thought. If you believe that that is going to encapsulate what you're trying to envision.
I used to have a bias of every athlete needs to have at least 6 training days, and that has completely shifted to 4 to 5. Because this is like me as a young coach. Because I just thought like more specificity was better. And at the end of the day, it ended up being worse because they just weren't recovering. So that was like one of my biggest biases when I first started.
Is that based on, we've discussed this before, like it was a while ago now, based on region, part of the country that you're from, the society or the culture that you have surrounded yourself? Was that more cultural? Because if you ask most coaches in the UK, they probably bias towards the 4 days. Probably.
I think it is mostly cultural, because I think a lot of US coaches do like 5 to 6 days. And like 6 days of benching or 5 days of benching and stuff like that. So it is mostly cultural, but also a mix of like just being young and not completely like, I didn't really know a lot about programming at that point. So I think it's like a mix of that.
And now that your bias has shifted, like what have you seen? What differences into like positive differences that you've seen off of the back of that for yourself, programming for your athletes?
Yeah. For myself, before I started getting coached with Callum, I feel like I'm less burnt out from training, just because I'm not in the gym 6 days a week, and I also personal train, so I'm in the gym like all day, so it's much better in that route. But for my athletes, their recovery has been much better. They don't feel like powerlifting is their life. They feel like powerlifting is part of their life. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So that's like the 2 biggest things. Just they are recovering better and they feel like they have enough time for everything else on top of powerlifting.
Are we just giving more biases of the things that we've done that are dumb? Or the ones that we have now that are constructive?
I love and I'm really partial to heavy singles throughout the year in some way, shape, or form. That does not have to be primary, but I am a big fan of it, particularly for bench. I think particularly when you're pushing, like, for example, there's different reasons for doing it for different people, but like I have the number one thing that I am finding so beneficial for myself, for a lot of my athletes, is tempo singles. And this usually leads me into like double primaries in a microcycle for bench. So if we're doing 4 days a week, that 2 of those be primary days, and that's wave loaded with the other 2. Seems to work well. Has been working really well anecdotally. I mean, Kat has just hit an all-time PR of 67 at an RPE like 7 kilos over what she hit at comp for a tempo. Ridiculous. So dumb, so silly. And her other primary is close grip. So it's like different grip, different touch point, different, like, you could definitely argue that there's so much stuff that's going wrong there. Or that doesn't really like make sense when it first meets the eye. I think this kind of comes along into a principle, which is another thing that I bias. And this is what, like, way more long term than like on a microcycle. This is usually like within cycles, or as you go from beginner to intermediate to advanced. I find that like frequency and sometimes volume as well, although volume's a little bit more dependent, but frequency and volume usually is like a peak and then a trough and then a peak. Beginners usually need more frequency and a little bit more volume, perhaps not the same intensity. Obviously, you need to strike the balance between those 3. Intermediates, as they get stronger, usually need a little bit less frequency and a little bit less volume, but need a little bit more intensity. And then as you get into that advanced level where your intensity is climbing consistently, then you can start to have need for the demand for more volume as time goes on. That is so dependent on who it is. And I haven't coached a wide enough skill set of athletes to be able to like quantifiably say that is the truth, but that is a bias that I'm definitely leading to, in that frequency is probably the thing that you'll change last. Like adding another day is probably the thing that will change last, and you'll probably lean a little bit more onto like increasing volume within a microcycle. But like I know for myself, maybe a year ago, had you given me the protocol that I have now and I was still doing 4 days, I would be dead, because I have 4x6 and a 3x6 twice a week on bench, like 6s. That is not fun. I really enjoy it now, but that for me, like little Brandon then probably would have died, because I wouldn't have had the technical proficiency to perform a 6 with just any degree of value.
If that was little Brandon, is this big Brandon?
This is medium Brandon.
Okay, I actually needed that.
This is that was Happy Meal Brandon. This is like adult meal Brandon.
It's the Charmeleon. Anyway, the first thing that you said that I really want to speak on, there's a bias that I think a few of us share, but other coaches really don't, because the last bit is like really quite open. But the use of the more aggressive use of variation, like to push top end. So like one thing, like aggressive use of variation that I see is either incredibly low intensity, whatever volume, that varies drastically, and people doing like say high bar sets of 5, 6, like 5. The other end of that is seeing people do like pause deadlifts, a 4x3 at like 7.58. I actually lean away from that end a little bit, but the bit I do lean to is, and I'll pick my like staples for this sort of principle, like pause deadlift, close grip bench, tempo bench, pause squat. They're probably my main ones. Pushing those much harder, like, and I don't see that with a lot of people, where it's like verging on their lifetime PB in a port, like on a given part of the cycle, probably not on comp prep, but like pushing those bits substantially harder. That's something I definitely bias towards, and it didn't come from someone else, which is why we spoke to another podcast that we listened to, which is like, if you can't explain your beliefs, they're not yours. But like mine just came from monstrous amounts of anecdotal practice and being like, I just always saw the payoff. But I'm sure another coach would be like, that's a really stupid thing to do. But it's definitely my bias.
No, as soon as Brandon said that as well, that's something that I've been experimenting with, specifically for the bench press. That the first thing that comes to mind is giving people heavier more, simply because it's a case of they need that intensity to follow through to their primary. So, and as of a variation of some degree for some people, and this is off the back of looking at Lucy's program when I was handling her a comp. Hi, Luce. But when I saw your program and I just saw the bench that was within that, I was like, oh fuck, have I just been like not given enough? And it's almost like a light bulb moment. I was like, these are people that they're not going to break by giving them one slightly heavier set or being a little bit more aggressive with that intensity. And lo and behold, it's working charm. More confidence, better repeatability, like things have just shown up a hell of a lot better. Where I would have had the understanding of it, but I was afraid of doing it. So I was like, I don't want to overpush them. But it's this case of they're not going to break.
I had one of my athletes who's been with me for like 4 years say to me that my last year of bench programming has drastically changed because of principles like that. And bench is one that I think had a good run with like certain beliefs, and like the last year is drastically different and the payoff has been significantly better. There's something, just to do a throwback Thursday to Coach Beck, God rest him. He actually put something on someone else's thing, and I don't know the legitimacy of this, and it's something that we probably do but don't know. He was talking about women's bench. He said it on one of the athletes, and they'd shared a story. The women bicep women basically load the tricep significantly more and the pec significant bias, that's the word, bias the tricep significantly more and the pec significantly less. And so in order to get them to load the pec enough, the load has to be enough. You have to be loading it more aggressively for them to use the pec more, which in principle I wouldn't have thought of when I was programming. I was programmed the same way, but I just credit to him for the principle that that's absolutely accurate and that functions that way. So I just thought it was a really cool principle. But in the bench programming as a whole, I used to be soft on all, frequency priority. So when we're saying there's three things, intensity would be my lowest tier, frequency and volume would be my highest tier. And now, very subjective to the person, as Brandon says, his volume is pretty high, his intensity is actually pretty low. Lucy's volume's, I would say, medium, intensity is climbing. Take someone like Amelia, intensity is very high, volume getting a little bit lower, and just like it's that variance between people. But the more intensity more often with moderate volume is something only very over the last year I played with much more so.
This conversation leans into my bias. I've been very tentative and hesitant to force work into an athlete. There's been instances where with Callum, like, I don't care about experimenting with myself, pushing myself to the absolute extreme of what's programmed, like programming too much, essentially. But I think with my athletes, I program too little, and it's definitely over the course of 6 months that bias has changed. Like I'm feeling more confident to test my athletes with more work within a week. So be it from in the introduction of a couple more sets or increasing their rep ranges or something like that. But I mean, to the extent of including SBD work before these previous 6 months, I wouldn't incorporate it at all. I was actually really against SBD work. I mean, obviously, from a sport point of view, we're looking for specificity. I'm not going to be able to say that word, specificity. But recently, I have included a lot more SBD work with my athletes, and it's paid off great. I've increased their workload, and subsequently, their progress has shot. So that's one of my biases, is just being too tentative with workload.
I think going off of that conversation of like SBD days, I think, Callum, we might have had this discussion alongside Beck and Alice and whatever, maybe a couple of years ago, where I don't think any one of us would have programmed an SBD day, or very, very rarely. I've seen quite a lot of change, and even in my own programming, I tend to find there's more relevance to SBD days now. Do I seek it? No, but will I utilize it in some form of way? And am I okay to use it? Yes. Specifically to you, Callum, like, what's your verdict on it? Because I have seen a few of your guys do SBD days now, but it's more a case of where's your mindset with that compared to what it used to be.
Hasn't changed. But the situation's changed. So I think
Yeah.
speaking specifically, like if we take yours as an example, right? So a few years ago, you did not use it. Your athletes were at a more beginner level, and your ability to work with them was like earlier on, where I was seeing the response with simpler data, and you were getting enough information over a good amount of time. And then I think you get to a stage with an athlete where it's getting the next step, getting new information, but it's a new approach. And so, like, I have not changed my opinion that if you have a beginner doing SBD, there's a single session, I think it's wasted time. And I think if you've got early intermediate doing it, there's like application timeframes to it that are probably more local to competition on the assumption that they're competing to a certain standard. As like your athletes that you worked with have gone from like the beginners have gone to like intermediate or advanced, and the intermediate gone to advanced, there's more opportunity or need to experiment with that sort of thing. And so I don't think it's necessarily even that our bias has shifted. The opportunity to apply the bias has shifted. And so like my application of it, twofold. One is with the distance from the sport someone wants to be. So I'll take Spencer as an example. Doesn't want to do much SBD work in the week at the moment. And I was like, well, I can go very distant with programming, but in order for me to get relevant information, now I'm going to do an SBD day, which we do like at the fourth quarter of every block. And so that's the opportunity to be like, what is the impact actually looking like? Because otherwise, if I go too distant for too long, I'm not going to have any idea if it's working. I have other athletes who do the SBD because of requirement, like 3 days per week, and being like, literally cannot fit it in. And so I have significantly more people doing that because my other bias, as Kun was speaking to, was either 4 days a week or 5 days a week. And then genuinely had a fuck me moment where it was like, oh, so 3 days a week works? Like, I did not anticipate good progress on 3 days a week. It was always my last ditch thing to try to help the athlete out so they can make things fit. And then they got stronger. And I was like, didn't anticipate that. Did not, like, don't get me wrong, I thought progress, but not better than the 4 days per week. And so, yeah, I think it's just been more opportunity for the application, but I do not think most people program them well. I think most of the time there's a lot of wasted opportunity, difficulty for people scheduling, like how much time someone has to be in the how many of your athletes, like, go as percentage, Ryan, just give me a rough thing. If I said all of them need to be 4 days a week, but one of them is going to be for 4 hours, would they have time?
No.
Like 90%, right? Like, wouldn't be able to do it, maybe 10. And I reckon, like, take someone in the chat, I'll say to Brandon, being like, you need to run SBD and it'll add 20 kilos to your total. He'd be like, yeah, I will eat shit and then whatever I need to do. But most of my athletes, like, would not. And so I just don't think the application's there very often. But I do think there's more to it than I'm aware. I do not think that people using it all the time would have the answers for me that would make me better at using it.
We do also have the outliers. I think Taylor, he just recently increased SBD days, so he's on 6, I believe. I'm not 100% sure on this, but I'm pretty sure I saw an article that he's now switched to 6 days SBD. So it's very interesting to me how to incorporate that in your training and still see results. The most extreme for myself is I've actually ran an athlete on a 4-day week, but then recently, due to limitations of time in the gym or days in a gym, I've actually reduced them to 3 working days in the week. But all 3 of them are SBD, highly specific, with minimal accessories. And recently, at her competition, she increased her total by 30 kilo, 9 for 9. So this helped shift my bias, or as Callum mentioned, that growth in application for SBD.
I was going to speak to, like, so what, Agatha, who's just gone, is she 7 now? And even on one day, she did 2 SBD sessions in the same day. The girl that trains with her, I apologize, I know her because we met her at the Arnold, but begins with a K. She's on 6 SBD sessions. Taylor, I don't know if he is on 6. If he is, that's amazing, but I know he was upping his frequency. And then Joe Game Day, who is Austin Perkins' coach, was speaking to the same thing. Go on, Brandon, say the point you're in the better.
Well, this is the thing I was saying, where, like, this is why I get this hunch that, like, higher frequency, higher volume is something that tailors very, very well to the elite. Although I haven't coached anyone who is like at this level that we're currently talking about, we see it time and time again where it's like, and we're really starting to culturally, we seem to really start to like push the boundaries now of like SBD every day. Like, why not? Do you know what I mean? So many people seem to be pushing that, but they can only really get off with it for those who are incredibly technically proficient.
If you say elite, but what if we throw 7 SBD days at super heavyweight, squatting 400 kilo? It's not going to happen because the total load going through, or does it work?
There is a caveat to all of this, obviously, because obviously I don't know the infrastructure of all of their days, but some of those sessions have massive, like what they're calling SBD is like a single pause and then nothing else. Though I agree with the principle, like I have not seen super heavy. Why are we saying super heavyweight? Everyone gave the BP brief for that. The like 100 kilo plus lifters, that's 2 South. You know my point is I've not seen that. I have seen these middleweight champions of the world using SBD days more frequently, anywhere from like 60 kilos through till 75. I've seen that range. I haven't seen anyone else personally.
Other than total tonnage, why not? Because surely you could still work it out with total tonnage anyway. That's just something that you'd have to accommodate under the intensity. Like you're looking at those 3 things. If frequency has to be this, or if we're setting frequency at this, then you can adjust volume and intensity to allow to have a lower total tonnage per week. Like if you're doing, is this where like infamous 3x7s, 3x8s come from?
Well, the OG of all of this before, like this is probably, you know how we talk about like an ice age being rotational over so many whatever time frames. The same thing in programming is, remember the Bulgarian method? And being like, hey, why did we stop doing it? Well, because everyone got injured. And being like, what we have not seen is the result of this. We've seen the short term, yeah, you get stronger. I have not seen what happens when your tendon snaps because of RSI injuries or just the impact over time of doing this stuff so frequently. So like I fear that these are going to be the biggest people in the sport for a really nice window until someone gets so broken they never come back. But I don't know. Like I am genuinely willing to change my program for next block to full SBD to see what happens.
So I learned from I've done a bunch of like coaches calls with other coaches outside of Dedicated by Design, and a lot of them are local to me here in Northern Ireland and Ireland. And one of them was Dean Gracie from Vici. And one of the things that he said to me that I absolutely love is he said that the poison isn't in the dose, it's in the time frame. And so if you're perpetually running like a Bulgarian style protocol, 100%, this is the thing of like, you're going to end up injured, repetitive change or whatever. But is that the query that I raise is then, well, is this as a result of the dose or the time frame? Like, could we then theoretically run Bulgarian, get maximum benefit from a Bulgarian cycle, and then pull right back into something that is nigh on the antithesis of it for the sake of recovery and regeneration, build a little bit with a block in between, and then go straight back to Bulgarian? Is that what the long term of 7 days a week SBD is actually going to look like within a competitive year?
I can't remember. Someone ran something very similar to how you've described it. I'd like to say it was Johnny.
They're dead now.
I think it was Johnny Candito. A few years years ago, but I'm pretty sure he ran something similar for a very short window of time to maximize the amount of gain that he can get from it, but then obviously not get injured. I don't know the results of it, but I'm pretty sure it was him who done it maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
He had incremental gains, but then massive drop off to his fatigue management. So I think he did do well off the back of it. One of the things I was just thinking about is we might actually, for the first time in powerlifting history, see someone overtrain. Like, we have heard the term forever. First time ever, going to see someone who actually begins with R, the actual thing that happens when your body breaks down. Like what overtraining this is, so it's like whatever it is, that can nearly kill you. If that happens to a powerlifting athlete, we'll have an answer. But I think everyone's Googling it. This is like being on a Joe Rogan podcast.
I
Yeah,
recently
so-
heard Ross speak about this when he was doing the
Yeah.
swim round UK and the Yukon, but he's recently now doing Iceland. He's halfway round right now,
Is
but
that
he was
right?
speaking to this, especially in hotter weather, that becomes a lot more apparent.
And so it will be interesting. And like, I know we've completely moved away from tangent, but from tangent. Oh my god, from the biases we were discussing. But I genuinely think this is one of the ones that the whole industry biased against, and everyone is about to get a new bias because it's trendy. But there's so much information in it. Rhabdo, of course, it's Rhabdo. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, genuinely, it's interesting to see if people actually start overtraining by pushing this extreme. And even what's weird to me is you take Austin Perkins, right, who is an outlier, a freak, and highly respondent, and he's just hit like the highest totals with, he can call it 5 for 9. We can debate that all day. But the now move to 6 days per week of being like of SBD, being like, I actually don't agree, because that seems like it's going good. What if it went better? And I think that's what makes sense.
Right. On that note,
Oh, no, it's just gonna be.
I know, but I need to go.
We'll call it there.
We'll call it there.
Fine.